Please, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Selpi, for the introduction. And as Selpi mentioned, it is completely okay if you want to ask questions during this presentation, if you have something that you want to discuss immediately. But then, of course, you will be recorded. So this talk has the same title as one of the projects that I will present. The talk is called Interpreting and Grounding Pre-trained Representations for Natural Language Processing. So it's quite a mouthful, and I will explain all of these different concepts that I have crammed into this title. First, I should mention that the empirical results that I will mention in this talk come from an investigation that was carried out mainly by my PhD students, Tobias Norlund and Lovisa Hagström. And we just got a paper accepted on the results that I will show you here. So I think actually Lovisa is with us today. So maybe if there is some particularly tricky question, I will just ask her to take that question. Okay, anyway, so what is this about? So the object that we will investigate is what we call pre-trained language models. So the introductions of these pre-trained language models is, I think, the most important development that has happened within the field of language processing in the last few years. So I think there was the breakthrough paper in 2018 that was called ELMO. There have been some famous other papers since then. OpenAI's series of GPT models you are probably aware of, and also Google's BERT models. So these are basically build on the same idea that we can train these language models on large amounts of text to get some sort of representation component for text. Of course, they differ technically in what kind of architectures they use and so on. So how do we train these models? So there are some different ways to do that. I would say that in essence, most of them are trained using some kind of filling in the blank training task. So if we have a text, for instance, I was sad before because my football team had something, and the goal of this training task is that the model should learn to predict what is the missing word, which would be lost in this case. And to do this, the model needs to account for several abstraction levels of language. So it needs, I mean, on a fairly basic level, it needs to have a proper model of, let's say, the basic properties of English grammar, so that we would have the right inflection in this context. We would have lost and not losing, or lose, for instance. But we also need to have a model of the meaning of the words, so that we know what a football team can do. It can win or lose or score goals and so on. And also the emotional relationship between people and the football teams. So it wouldn't make sense to say that I was sad because my football team had won. So in short, the model needs to deal with many different phenomena in language. And the other reason why this is such an attractive training task is that it is very easy to generate training data. We can just scrape text. Typically, these models are trained on Wikipedia or, well, news that have been scraped from the web. So the fashionable term for this type of training is self-supervised training, which simply means that we can, I mean, basically this is a supervised setup, but we can remove some part of this, of the data that we have, and ask the model to predict it. So this turns out to be super effective. So how do we then use these language models to build applications? So it is more or less plug and play. So let's say, for instance, we want to build some sort of text categorization system, such as spam filters or topic classifiers, sentiment analysis, and so on. What we do is that we take the pre-trained language models, such as BERT in this case. we plug some classification head on top of the representation model, and we just need to learn the parameter of this classification head, which is typically much easier than learning the whole model. So this turns out to give a very good performance for many different language processing tasks, ranging from structurally simple things like text categorization to more complex tasks such as, well, entity recognition, translation, summarization, and so on. So this figure comes from Google's BERT paper, which is, and BERT is the model that we will base the work that I will be presenting here. So this is all good and nice, but there are some limitations. And one limitation is that we have a limited understanding of what is going on inside of these models. What can they do? What are the limitations? Another observation that many people have made is that, let's say, the classical language processing pipelines would typically carry out a detailed analysis of the language in a sequential manner. So we would start by, well, splitting words into, splitting sentences into words. We would then maybe find the, well, nouns and verbs and so on. Maybe we would find the names. Then we would find relationships between these different words in the sentence. So we would have a detailed analysis of the text in many different steps. So using these representational models, we don't have to have that. And there are many people who think that this means that these structures that we used to compute previously, they are actually there in the latent representation of the learned representation. But is it possible to see it in some way? So there's a whole cottage industry that sometimes people call BERTology, where people try to relate the learned representation to some kind of analysis of the language. Another limitation is that while these models are very successful, there's much information available that is not most naturally encoded using text. So there are different modalities. There are images and videos and so on, and other types of sensory information. There is also much structural information available in databases, ontologies, and so on. So it is a technical challenge to integrate the language-based models with other types of information sources. So these two challenges that I have mentioned, they are at the core of a new project that started about 1 year ago that is called, that has the same name as this talk. It's called Interpreting and Grounding Pre-trained Representations for NLP. And the goals are exactly what I mentioned, so that we want to develop new methods to analyze what is going on inside of these language representation models, and also to try to integrate the language representation models with other kinds of information. And in this talk, we will see both sides of this, of the project goals. So this is a collaboration between Chalmers, Linköping University, and Recorded Future, which is a Gothenburg company. And we have 3 PhD students, 1 at each site. So in this talk, we are mainly going to look at the relationship between language and vision, and how vision can improve the representation of language. So there are many people who have made the observation, as we mentioned previously, that a pure textual signal is probably not always going to be enough. So as they argue in this famous position paper, you cannot learn language simply by listening to the radio. You need also something else. You need to have some kind of experience. So we are going to try to investigate the limitations of purely text-based models and see if there is something to be gained by also using a visual signal. So we are going to look at multimodal language models that combine language with the visual signals. And this is also a whole cottage industry. There are many such models now that combine language with some kind of visual signal. So this, of course, they differ in their technical details. This figure comes from the paper that describes the Oscar model. But in essence, they are all similar, that they combine the text with some kind of representation of an image that could come from some off-the-shelf object detection system. And then this image representation would be fed together with the text representation into some joint models so that we get a representation of the language and the image at the same time. So the investigations that we are going to have in this presentation, so we are going to see how well is basic visual information represented in the language models that we often use today. And the test case we are going to consider is maybe the most basic visual property, color. So we are going to look at how well are the language models aware of the typical colors of common objects. And we are also going to look at if we can improve the performance of the language representation models by adding visual signals. And the method that we are going to use to try to test this is called querying. So basically, we ask the model about colors in our case. So this method of querying language models has been used in many different research projects. So one of the most famous recent examples is from a paper that is called Language Models as Knowledge Bases, where the idea was to test the language models for encyclopedic knowledge. So what is the capital of Sweden, or what is the birthplace of Dante, and so on. And in this case, the idea is that we take the question and just remove the word that we are looking for and see how well is the model able to fill in the blank. So this is exactly what we will do, but considering the colors of objects then. So in our case, it would look something like this. The color of grass is some hidden word, and then the goal is to fill in the missing color name, which would be green in this case. So, of course, grass is not always green. In some situations, grass would be brown or some other color. So what we are thinking of here is an intuitive notion of a prototypical color or default color. In the cognitive science and optical science fields, this idea of an intuitive color is called a memory color. And probably you can understand this on an intuitive level. So of course, a tomato can have many different colors, but probably the color that we associate with tomatoes would be red, for instance, or the color that we would associate with a lemon would be yellow, even though it is possible that a lemon might have other colors than yellow. So I think you probably have an intuition of what we are after. So what we did was that we gathered a bunch of such objects that we could think of. So we had, I don't remember the exact figure now, it was probably 120 or 130 objects. And we had 11 people who were asked questions about what they thought was the typical color of that object. So we removed some of these objects where we saw that there was actually a diversity of opinions. So in the end, we got 109 such objects. These objects would have one of 11 colors. So what we get in the end would be, for instance, the word lemon, and the typical color it would have, which would be yellow in this case. For comparison, we also include an image, which we will use in some experiments later. But the main thing we need is the name of the object and its color. So this data set we call the memory colors, after this notion of memory colors. So the multimodal model that we are going to consider is a new model that we call CLIP-BERT. So what we do is that we take a regular transformer-based language representation model that is called BERT, and we feed an image representation into it. And this image representation has been computed by a pre-trained image representation model that is called CLIP, which was developed by OpenAI this year. So we basically take this BERT model, and then we also feed it. We also feed the image representation to it. But we train it so that it should predict the missing words as a regular BERT model would be trained. So the training instances for this model would be pairs of texts with the corresponding image, such as a red car is parking, and here would be the image for that. And the training data for this model is a combination of some well-known language and vision datasets. So these have been developed for different purposes. A typical use case for these datasets would be to develop image captioning systems. So we combine all of these datasets, and in the end we get about 4.7 million training instances. So each of these instances would be one text and one image. So then let us see how well this train model performs on the dataset that we have developed. So the memory colors dataset with the 109 objects. So in this case, now we are at test time, and we will see how well does the model do if it doesn't have the image. So how can we do that? So the model was trained with an image, but now we don't have the image. So there are some different ways we can go about this. So the simplest way is what we call the implicit transfer approach. So in this case, we just simply remove, we simply don't feed any image representation to the model. So if we have the text, for instance, the color of blood is something, the goal of the model would be to predict red, but we don't have the image of blood. But so what is the intuition why this would work? So basically, we are learning with some kind of side information. So at training time, we also have the image of the object. And the goal is that by having this image, it would make it easier for the model to learn, so that it would be easier to answer these types of questions with just the text. But if you think of, if I would ask you about what is the color of blood, you would probably think of blood, and then you would answer the question. So could we develop a model that would actually think of blood in order to answer such question? So this leads to the second approach, which is called explicit transfer. So basically, in this case, we have a step where, given the text, the model tries to predict not an image of blood, but a representation of an image of blood. So this model that this image representation model that we mentioned before, so CLIP, it comes actually with two different parts. One is the image representation part that we use to train this BERT model, but it also has a text representation part that will project the text representation into the same space as the image representation. So if we speak of blood, we could get a representation of an image of blood. So at test time, we take the text, we try to predict the representation of a visual representation of this text, and then we feed this representation into the model in the same way as we previously fed the images. Okay, so let's see how this works empirically, these different approaches that we have developed. Before we see the actual results, we will see some baselines. So in this case, we have 11 colors. So the accuracy of guessing purely uniformly randomly would be about 9%. If we would always guess the most common color, which is white, I think we would get an accuracy about 23%. And if we take an off-the-shelf BERT model and ask these color questions, we get an accuracy of about 25%. So as you see, the off-the-shelf language model is surprisingly poor for such simple questions. Even though it's a very successful model, it performs quite poorly. And we might speculate about reasons for this, but one possible reason is that in practice, in regular text, we probably don't talk so much about the colors of common things. If I'm talking about tomatoes, it is probably redundant to say that it's red because everyone knows the color of a tomato. We would probably just mention the color of the tomato if it was unusual. So this issue has been noted before, this issue of reporting bias of the common properties. We can also compare to human performance on this task. It is 94 in this case. I think this is, I mean, the reason that we don't get 100% is probably simply because colors are continuous, and it is in some cases hard to draw the line, what exactly is pink and what is orange and so on. So let us see how well the new models perform. So it turns out that we get much better results with the new model in both cases. So if we just use the pure text representation and no image representation, so the implicit transfer strategy, we get an accuracy of 74%. So it's obviously much better than what we had before, 25%. And if we also have the visual imagination step, we get an even higher accuracy of 87%. So this seems to be fairly successful. We can compare this to what we get if we actually have the image available and use the image representation part of the CLIP model. In this case, we get slightly higher than when we don't have any text, when we don't have any image. So this looks quite nice, right? Well, actually, maybe we are cheating a bit here, because the original BERT model hasn't seen all this language and vision data that the other models have. And it turns out that probably in the language and vision datasets, people speak about the colors of objects quite a lot. So if we develop a more realistic baseline, so if we take a pure text-based models, but we train it also on these on the language part of these language and vision datasets, it turns out that we get much better accuracy. So as I said, in these cases, they speak about the colors of objects quite a lot. So in this case, we get an accuracy that is almost as high as what we got for the implicit transfer strategy. So in order to disentangle these different effects that we observe here, we try to control for this annoying issue of the objects, of the color of objects being mentioned in the text, so that we removed all the texts where one of these objects was mentioned together with its color, so we wouldn't have any yellow lemons or red tomatoes in the training data. So after this filtering, we had removed about 6% of the text. So now we can see the effects a bit more clearly. So if we train the BERT model on this filtered text, we get an improvement, but it will still be below both of the multimodal prediction approaches. So with the implicit transfer, we still get quite a bit better than the pure text-based model, but the most notable difference is between the explicit transfer approach, where we have where we predict an image representation from the text. So to conclude this discussion, we have looked at a simple investigation into how well language models, off-the-shelf language models and multimodal language models can deal with simple visual properties, in this case, maybe the most basic visual property, the colors of objects. And we developed a new data set for this purpose. And it turned out that standard language models that we just take off the shelf perform quite poorly on this data set, almost like a majority baseline. And we saw that we can get much better performance if we use multimodal training. And there are several reasons for this. Maybe the most straightforward reason is that in these multimodal datasets, the colors of objects are mentioned, but we also saw that we can improve the language representation by having the visual information available at training time, or we can improve the performance even more by having a visual imagination step. But we need to be methodologically quite careful when we are looking at these effects. So if we carry out the experiments naively, we might be overly optimistic. So we need to have a realistic baseline and try to control for the different effects. So currently we are expanding on this work that we have seen here. So right now we just looked at the accuracies, but it would also be interesting to look at how does the multimodality affect the ease of learning. So if we have the multimodal representations available, will it be easier for the models to learn? So we are going to look at the learning curves also. And color is just one visual property, and maybe there are also other visual properties that we can investigate. So we are looking at some different data sets for this purpose. So another development I would like to mention is that we also have another project that hasn't started yet. So this new project is called Representation Learning for Conversational AI, and it is a collaboration with KTH. And in this case, we are going to look at interactive language, so dialogues. And in this case, we are going to train new language representation models tailored for interactive language. And also we are going to develop analysis methods that look at this type of language and the challenges of conversational language and see how well the language models perform in this setting. So thanks for your attention. So now I think we can take the question. So Selby, if you want to stop the recording.